No one gives us shelter." The old orc's voice broke against the wind as she arrived with her 2 daughters at the farmer's door, green skin pale from the cold, eyes empty but defiant. None of the 4 knew that night would change everything. The snow had no mercy that night. It fell in thick curtains across the valley, burying the old wagon trail under white silence. 3 figures moved through it slowly, a woman old enough to carry the weight of decades, and 2 younger ones close behind her, heads bowed against the wind. Jaraka walked first. She always had. Even when her knees ached, even when the cold turned her breath to smoke and her fingers to stone, she kept moving. At 55, her green skin had the texture of old bark, still vibrant, still jade-bright, but marked by years that had not been gentle. Her hair, long and silver-streaked, was braided with small bones from the clan's first rituals. She had once called rain with her voice alone. Now that voice was hoarse from begging. Behind her came Craver, 22, tall and strong-shouldered, her dark braids stiff with frost. She said nothing. She rarely did anymore. Her eyes, the color of deep moss, scanned every shadow, every farmhouse silhouette in the distance, with the same calculation she had learned after the first door slammed in their faces. Then Lishara, 20, the youngest, still soft around the edges, still carrying something that resembled hope, even when the cold pushed her to her knees. She stumbled, caught herself, and kept walking. Her small, discreet fangs were hidden behind pressed lips as she breathed through the storm. They had been walking for 4 days. The Grak River lands were behind them now, not because they had chosen to leave, but because they had been pushed. The Presa Quebrada clan had once roamed those valleys freely, following the seasons, honoring the old totems carved into canyon rock. Then the settlers came. First 1 family, then 10, then entire townships that drew lines across the land with rope and iron and words, written in a language the orcs were never taught to read. The treaties came next, promises made with ink that dried faster than blood, and then the rifles, the clans scattered like seeds in a hard wind. Some went south toward the Canyon das Sombras Verdes, others disappeared into the Deserto Arido das Sombras, where the heat could swallow a soul whole. Jaraka had taken her daughters and gone north, following a rumor, a settlement near the Hollow Creek Ridge, where orcs were said to be tolerated. The rumor had been wrong. At the first farm, a man had shouted from his window before they reached the gate. At the second, a boy, no older than Lishara, had come out with a shotgun trembling in his arms, his face pale with fear or hate or both. At the third, a woman had watched them from behind curtains and never moved at all. No food, no shelter, no mercy. Jaraka had stopped counting after the 5th door. Now she walked with her eyes on the horizon, because that was the only direction left. The wind howled through a gap in the hills ahead, and for a moment she thought she heard something inside it. The low, resonant sound she associated with the ancestor spirits, a warning maybe, or a promise. She had long since stopped knowing the difference. It was Lishara who saw it first, a thin thread of smoke, barely visible against the dark sky, rising from somewhere beyond the next ridge. "Mama!" she said, her voice barely above the wind. Jaraka stopped. She looked. The smoke was real, pale grey against black clouds, thin but steady. Someone had a fire burning. Her hand moved instinctively to the bone totem at her belt. She had not used it in weeks. She was afraid it had gone quiet. But under her cold fingers she felt something, the faintest pulse like a heartbeat half-remembered. She did not call it a sign, not yet. But she turned toward the smoke and kept walking. The cabin sat low against the hillside, as if the land itself had grown tired and sat down. It was small. 1 room, a stone chimney, a fence that had seen better winters, but the fire inside was real, and the light it pushed through the shutters was the warmest thing the 3 of them had seen in days. Jaraka stopped at the edge of the yard. The snow here was undisturbed. No tracks but theirs, no dogs, no movement, just the creak of a shutter in the wind and the thin curl of smoke above the chimney. She raised her hand. The girls stopped behind her. "We don't know this man," Craver said quietly. "We don't know any man," Jaraka replied, "but we have no more road." She walked to the door and knocked. Inside, Callum heard it. He had been sitting by the fire for the better part of the evening, running a whetstone along the edge of a hunting knife with slow, automatic strokes, the kind of work a man does when his hands need something to hold. The cabin was quiet the way it always was, heavy with the absence of things that used to be there. A second chair, a woman's coat on the hook by the door. The smell of food cooked for more than one. On the table, beside a half-eaten piece of bread, sat a small photograph. A woman in her Sunday dress, smiling the way people smiled when they didn't yet know what was coming. His mother, dead 3 winters back. He kept the photograph because the smile was the last honest thing in the room. When the knock came, he went still. He waited. It came again, 3 strikes, slow and deliberate. Not the knock of a drunk neighbour, not a lawman's knock, something quieter than both. He set the knife down and crossed to the door. His hand rested on the latch for a moment, and he was aware, in the way a man alone in a blizzard is aware of everything, that whatever was on the other side of that wood would not leave the night the same. He opened it. The cold came in first, hard and immediate. Then he saw them, 3 figures in the snow, their green skin pale at the edges where the cold had drained the colour from the surface. The old one in front, tall, even bent, her silver braids stiff with ice, her eyes dark and unwavering. Behind her 2 younger women, one with her jaw set like iron, the other with a trembling that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with endurance. They said nothing. He said nothing. The old woman's eyes held his for a long moment. He had seen eyes like that before, in men who had been in the war and come back different. The kind of eyes that had already calculated the worst and kept going anyway. "Then you should take shelter here," he said. He stepped back from the door. They came in slowly, as if kindness were a thing that might collapse underfoot. The youngest looked around the cabin with wide eyes, at the fire, the bread, the photograph on the table. The older daughter kept her gaze low and guarded. The old woman moved to the center of the room and stood very still, like she was listening to the space before she trusted it. Callum put a pot over the fire, without asking. He tore his last loaf into thirds and soaked each piece in the broth until it softened. He set the bowls on the table and went to sit on the floor by the fire, leaving the chairs for them. He did not think about it, he just did it. Lishara smiled when she lifted the bowl, despite the chattering of her teeth, despite the cold still deep in her bones. Her small fangs caught the firelight for a moment. Craver said nothing, and ate slowly, her eyes moving once to Callum's face, and then away. Jaraka held the bowl in both hands for a long time before drinking, her lips moving in something low and guttural that was not directed at anyone in the room. Callum watched the fire and listened to the storm press against the walls. He forgot his own portion entirely. The storm did not stop for 4 hours. It pressed against the cabin walls like something alive, something with intention. The shutters shook, the chimney moaned, but inside the fire held. And the 3 orc women slowly came back to themselves, colour returning to their skin, the stiffness leaving their shoulders, breath coming easier. Callum sat on the floor near the fire and said very little. He was not a man given to many words. His neighbours in the valley, the few who still nodded to him when he passed, called him quiet in the polite way people use when they mean something closer to lonely. He had come to this land 7 years back with his wife, and the plan all young couples carry like a second heartbeat. The plan had not survived its 3rd winter. He had stayed anyway, because there was nothing else left to go back to, and because the land had taken enough from him that leaving felt like losing twice. He had scars on his hands, a ridge along his left jaw that came from a fence post that had caught him wrong in a windstorm. He was 30 years old and already moved like a man who had learned to brace for things. Lishara was the first to speak. She asked, in halting but careful words, what his name was. He told her. She said it back slowly, like she was learning the shape of it. Then she offered her own name, her sister's, her mother's, Jaraka, of the Presa Quebrada clan, once of the Grach River Valley. Callum nodded at each name as if filing them somewhere careful. Then Jaraka spoke. Her voice was low, built from deep in the chest, the kind of voice that had once commanded spaces much larger than this. She spoke in fragments, pausing to find words in his language that matched what she meant. Her own language lived underneath, occasionally surfacing when the right word escaped her. She told him about the Grach River, about the 3 seasons the clan had farmed and hunted there without conflict, before the survey teams arrived with their iron stakes, about the morning the riders came with rifles and a document no one had explained to them, about walking, about doors. She did not say it with anger. She said it the way a person states weather, something that happened, something real, something that does not require your permission to be true. Callum listened. He did not fill the silences with apologies or explanations. He had learned in his own years of loss that some things do not need a response, only a witness. Craver had not spoken at all. She sat with her back straight, her bowl empty in her hands, watching Callum with the particular attention of someone deciding something slowly. She was measuring. Not hostility exactly, but the careful distance between trust and its absence. When Jaraka finished, the fire had burned lower, and outside the storm had begun to ease. Callum spread blankets on the floor, all he had, including the one from his own bed. He told them to sleep. He would stay up. "You don't need to watch," Jaraka said. "I know," he said. He stayed up anyway. He turned the photograph of his mother face down, not to forget her, but because what she had always said was enough for tonight. Kindness is the only home a soul can build. He kept the words. Let the image rest. The storm settled into a low hum. The fire clicked and breathed. And in the quiet, Callum heard something he had not heard in a long time, the sound of a house that held more than one soul. Morning came grey and still. The blizzard had emptied itself in the night, leaving behind a silence so complete that Callum could hear the wick of the oil lamp when he lit it. The snow outside was deep, knee-high in the yard, chest-high against the north fence. The world had been remade in white and cold. Inside, the cabin smelled of breath and old fire and something unfamiliar. The dried herbs Jaraka had quietly produced from a pouch at her belt, pressing them into the last of the broth before she slept. The smell was green and sharp and not unpleasant. Over the following days the snow melted in stages, the roof first, then the yard, then the lane leading down to the road. The 3 women stayed. There was no formal arrangement, no language was used for it. They simply remained, and he simply did not ask them to go, and by the 3rd day it had become its own kind of understanding. Jaraka took charge of the kitchen in the way strong women take charge of things, not by asking permission, but by beginning. She found dried corn in a tin on the shelf, and spices in her own pack, and combined them into something that filled the cabin with heat and the faint sensation of being somewhere safe. She cooked in silence mostly, occasionally speaking in her own language. Soft, guttural sounds, directed at no one visible. Addressing something older than the room, Lishara moved through the cabin like light through a narrow window, quick, unpredictable, brightening corners that had been dim for years. She found dried wildflower stems in the rafters where Callum's wife had left them and arranged them on the table. She fixed a hinge that had been loose on the shutter for 2 seasons. She laughed at small things. at the crow that tried to land on Callum's hat, at the way the barn cat regarded her with absolute suspicion. The laughter was foreign to the cabin. It took up space in a way that felt almost wrong at first, and then necessary. Creva worked. She came out each morning and looked at the land the way someone looks at a problem they intend to solve. She mended fences and pulled dead brush from the south field. She worked beside Callum in silence for hours, and that silence was different from the one he had lived with before. His old silence had been hollow. This one had weight. One evening, Callum found her standing at the edge of the field with a shovel across her shoulders, watching the sky go pink along the ridge. He stood beside her without speaking. "You have good land," she said finally. "It's had bad years," he replied. She nodded, as if that were exactly the right answer. Then she said something that surprised him. "My mother says you have a sad house." She paused. She means it as an observation, not a criticism. Callum looked at the cabin, the dark windows, the fence line he had rebuilt alone after the third winter. "She's right," he said. Creva looked at him then. Briefly, the first direct look she had given him since arriving. Not measuring this time, just seeing. She said nothing more, and they walked back to the cabin together through the last light, their boots leaving 2 sets of tracks in the half-frozen mud. He noticed them, 2 sets, side by side, and said nothing, and did not look away from them either. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way difficult things often do, slowly, unevenly, with days of false starts and retreats. A warm morning followed by 3 cold ones. Mud beneath ice, but it came, and with it the farm woke. Jaraka planted things in the south garden that Callum had not known to plant. Roots from seeds she kept in a small leather pouch. Things the Presa Quebrada clan had grown beside the Grac River for generations. She worked the soil with her hands directly, pressing seeds in at intervals she counted under her breath, occasionally pausing to listen to something the others couldn't hear. She told him the names in her own language first, then found their rough equivalents in his, a bitter herb that kept fever down, a broad-leafed plant that drew rain when burned in dry weather, a vine that bore blue fruit in autumn. He watched and learned. Lishara filled the spaces between work with herself, armloads of early wildflowers, songs in the Orc tongue that meant something close to this moment, this breath. This is enough. The barn cat gave in and began following her everywhere. But one afternoon, Lishara did not sing. She had gone to the creek alone to collect water and came back changed, quiet in a way that was not her natural quiet. She set the bucket down without a word and sat near the fire, her hands in her lap. Jaraka watched her but waited. It was only at dusk, when Callum had gone to the barn, that Lishara spoke. "A man at the creek," she said. "He didn't come close, but he watched from the trees for a long time." Jaraka said nothing. She took the bone totem from her belt and held it, her thumb moving over the carved symbols with slow deliberateness. "Did he have a badge?" she asked. "No, just a long coat and patience." The two of them sat with that for a moment. "Don't tell Creva tonight," Jaraka said. "She'll want to leave, and leaving is not what the spirits are asking of us." Lishara looked at her mother. "What are they asking?" Jaraka set the totem on the hearthstone, to hold still. Trouble only chases what runs. That night, Lishara watched Callum eat without knowing he was being watched, and she thought about what it meant to hold still in a place where the ground itself kept trying to push you out. She thought about the man in the trees. She thought about every door they had knocked on before this one. She decided quietly and without ceremony that she was done running. It was the first grown decision she had made in her life, and she kept it to herself like a stone in a closed fist. Between Creva and Callum, the work remained the language, but it was changing. They rose early and went to the fields together and fell into a rhythm that made the days go fast. He taught her the way this particular valley's soil behaved, turned twice before planting. Stones cleared every season because the frost kept pushing them up. She absorbed everything and applied it the next day with precision. He began, without deciding to look for her in the morning before he looked for anything else. One afternoon in the third week of spring, a fence post snapped while Craver was pulling wire against it. The wire whipped back and caught her forearm, not deep, but enough to bleed. She said nothing and kept working, pressing the heel of her hand against the cut. Callum crossed the row without asking and took her arm. She let him. He cleaned the cut with water from his canteen and tied a strip of cloth around it, his movements careful and unhurried. When he finished, neither of them moved immediately. Her arm was still in his hands. The cut was small. The holding was not about the cut. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just stop ignoring wounds." She looked at him with something sharp and brief that might, on another face, have been a smile. That evening, Jaraka watched the two of them at the table, the small distance between their chairs, the way Callum passed the bread before she asked for it, the way Craiva's shoulder had lost its habitual set. The old woman stirred the pot and murmured to the ancestors with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a thing she planted finally take root. Then the horses came. 4 sets of hooves on the lane. Slow, deliberate. Callum heard them and straightened. He crossed to the window and saw 4 riders at the edge of the yard, hard-faced men. Long coats. The one in front wore a Settler Association badge that caught the afternoon light. Hendricks. Callum went out with his rifle on his arm. The women stayed inside, but Craver moved to the window and stood there, visible, deliberate, not hiding. Hendricks looked at her through the glass and then at Callum. "Didn't know you'd taken in strays, Voss." The word landed in the yard between them. "They are under my roof," Callum said, his voice level. "Show respect or leave." One of the men spat on the ground. Another shifted his weight in the saddle with a slow, practiced insolence. Hendricks smiled, the kind of smile that means the decision hasn't been made yet, but is being considered carefully. Then the cabin door opened. Jaraka stepped out. She did not carry a weapon. She walked to the middle of the yard and stood beside Callum, and she looked at the 4 men on horseback with the absolute composure of a woman who had stared down worse things than badge-wearing cowards on horses. In her left hand, loose at her side, she held the bone totem. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her stillness had its own weight. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not fear exactly, but the recognition that this was a different kind of ground than he had expected. He pulled his reins. "Shame about your judgment, Voss," he said flatly, and rode. Callum stood in the yard until the dust settled. Then Jaraka touched his forearm once, her bone-adorned fingers, a wordless thing, and went back inside without ceremony. That night, after the others had gone to sleep, Craver came outside. Callum was on the old bench near the fence, looking at the sky. Clear and cold, stars so thick they gave the yard a faint silver light. He heard her footsteps and did not turn. She sat beside him, not close but not far. For a while neither of them spoke. The night insects were not yet back from winter, so the silence was the pure kind, just wind in the grass and the occasional creak of a cooling beam in the barn roof. "You didn't have to come out," she said. When Hendricks spoke, "Yes, I did," he said. "Why?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things, slowly, without hurry. "Because you were here," he said. "Because this is where you are." She looked at him then, the full and direct look, not the measuring calculation of the early weeks, not the guarded appraisal of a woman deciding whether a man could be trusted. Something settled, the kind of look that happens when a decision has already been made and the looking is only a confirmation. He looked back. Their fingers were close on the bench, not touching, but close enough that neither could claim not to notice. After a long moment, the sides of their fingers brushed, and the cold between them was suddenly less. Neither of them moved away. In the morning, Callum rose before the others and walked the south field's edge, checking the soil the way he did every dawn. He came to the old cedar at the east corner, the tree where he had buried his mother after her last winter, where he sometimes came to sit when the cabin felt too quiet. At its base, where the roots broke through the frost-cracked earth, a single small flower had opened, winter-pale, thin-stemmed, with no reasonable business being alive in this cold. He crouched and looked at it for a long time. He heard footsteps behind him. Craver stopped beside him and crouched too, studying the flower with the same attention she gave everything that mattered. She touched it with 2 fingers, lightly, the way she handled fragile and important things. "Spring has finally arrived," she said softly. He said nothing, but he stayed beside her at the base of that old cedar for a long time, in the cold and the new light, neither of them in a hurry to go back inside. And in him, the part that had been braced for years, went quiet. The weeks that followed moved with new weight, not slower, not faster, just heavier with meaning. The kind of weight that comes when ordinary things begin to carry more than themselves. A shared meal, a task taken up without asking. The way a morning feels different when it starts with more than one voice in it. Callum had not thought much about the future in years. He had thought about the next season, the next fence. That was not the same thing. Now, without deciding to, he had begun again. He repaired the second room, the storage room with its permanently half-open door. He cleared it out, rebuilt the shelves, put a new window frame in where the old one had rotted. He told himself it was because the cabin was too crowded with 4 people. This was true, but not the whole truth. Jaraka watched him work on it one afternoon and said nothing. But the next morning he found the old cedar chest, the one from the corner of the main room, moved into the new space, freshly cleaned and placed with care. He left it there. Then the notice arrived, a folded document with a wax seal from the county land office, delivered by courier on a Tuesday. It informed Callum Voss that a claim had been filed against his property for harbouring individuals in violation of the Valley Settlement Compact, a document he had never been shown and never signed. He had 30 days to respond or vacate. He read it twice, set it on the table beside the bone totem. That night he told them directly, without softening it. When he finished, Lishara was the one who spoke first. "We'll leave," she said. It was quiet and steady, the voice of someone who had made peace with motion. "We don't want your land taken because of us." "No," Callum said. Lishara looked at him. "We stay," he said. "All of us." Lishara held his eyes for a moment, and something in her settled, deep and permanent, like a root-finding stone. She had made her decision weeks ago at the fireside. Now she understood that he had made his too, and that the 2 decisions were the same decision. "Then we fight it," she said. Jaraka, who had been listening with her hands folded, reached into her pack and placed the bone totem on the center of the table. She built a small fire in the hearth, a precise, deliberate thing, and fed it 3 small items she did not explain. The smoke rose thicker than it should have, coiling against the draught, carrying a smell older than the wood it came from. She spoke into it for a long time. When she finished, she looked at Callum. "The ancestors know this place now," she said. "They have been here since the first night. We do not run." Callum rode to the county seat the next morning and retained a lawyer named Parrish, a tired, honest man who took the case for half his fee and seemed personally irritated by the filing on principle. But the association was not finished. 3 days after the notice, Hendricks came back, this time with 6 riders, not 4, and they stopped not at the gate, but in the road directly in front of the property line. They made no move to enter. They simply waited there, visible from the window, as if their presence alone were the message. Callum watched from inside. Then he looked at Craver. She had already picked up her work coat. They went out together, Callum with his rifle on his arm, Craver with a long-handled planting tool resting on her shoulder. Not a weapon, just the thing she'd been carrying when the riders appeared. They walked to the fence line and stopped, said nothing. Jaraka came out behind them, then Lishara. The four of them stood at the edge of the yard and looked at 6 armed men in the road, and not one of them moved or spoke or gave ground. Jaraka held the totem at her side. Lishara stood with her chin level and her eyes open, the softness in her face replaced by something older. The silence stretched. The horses shifted. One of the men muttered something to Hendricks that could not be heard from the fence. Hendricks looked at the 4 of them, the farmer, the 2 young women, the old one with her bone totem and her absolute stillness, and whatever calculation he was making did not come out in his favor. He turned his horse. The others followed. Parrish sent word 2 weeks later the filing had been withdrawn, no explanation given. Callum read the letter at the table with all of them present and set it down without ceremony. Lishara exhaled. Jaraka nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she already knew. That evening, Callum walked the south field alone at dusk. The garden was showing green along the beds, Jaraka's roots pushing up through the soil with quiet insistence. The new window of the second room caught the last light and threw a warm rectangle across the yard. He stopped at the old cedar and stood for a while. The small flower at its base was gone. The frost had finally taken it, as it eventually takes everything that blooms too early. But where it had been, he could see the faint scar in the earth where the roots had heaved and broken through. It had been there. It had opened. That was enough. He heard the cabin door and Craver's boots on the frozen ground. She came to stand beside him without asking why he had stopped. "Will you stay?" he asked. He had not said it before in so many words. She was quiet for a moment. "We have nowhere else to go," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him, fully, without guard. "Yes," she said. They walked back to the cabin together through the darkening field. The lamp was already lit inside. Jaraka's silhouette moving in the warm window, Lishara's voice carrying something low and rhythmic out through the walls. One of her untranslatable songs, the kind that meant this moment, this breath, this is enough. Somewhere far south, beyond the Cañón das Sombras Verdes, a lone rider was asking questions about the women who had gone north, about the valley near Hollow Creek, where something unusual had taken root. The rider wore a totem at his neck, old bone, marked with the same symbols as the one on Callum's table, and he was not in a hurry. The valley was still. The garden was growing. Spring had arrived and this time intended to stay. But the world beyond the fence had not finished moving. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orcbound Legacy.